There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another year. This is the 9th annual Besties and Worsties video. I am late getting it to you because I've had a terrible cold since New Year's Day. I'm finally recording this on January 9th. Way late for me, but I think you'll still enjoy it, won't ya? And my voice is still not that great, but I think I can get through. I'm probably going to be talking for about an hour and a half, try to edit it down to about 60 minutes. That's a lot of talking when my voice is not great, and I've got some wine as a lubricant, and what could possibly go wrong? Because I really want to read stuff to you. That's my favorite part, and I think maybe for many of y'all too, is the excerpts that I read. So the first award, as always, is Best Opening Line or Paragraph. And I have a tie this year between two novels that I really loved, both from the UK. This is the Scottish novel, The Old Haunts, by Alan Radcliffe. I have a full interview with him about this novel. It's about a gay Scottish couple. They're fairly newly together. Jamie has lost both of his parents in the last, I think, 8 months. I forget which parent died closer to the present. But after that funeral, his boyfriend Alex takes him on a little holiday to another part of Scotland that Alex knows very well. And here's the opening. 3 very short paragraphs. The chapter is called We Don't Drink Beer. After the house was sold, we drove north to Omri, a cinematic place at the western end of Loch Tay. My head had been full of grey, a sky with no sunshine, and Alex thought the change of scene might help turn me back into myself. It was March suddenly. The year was pulling at its reins. Alex had surprised me with a crumpled printout, brandished like a long-stemmed rose. He knew our destination well, having grown up nearby, and he knew that I had taken that holiday there with my family. So it was a meaningful place for both of us. We kept pausing on the drive up, so he could get out of the car with his camera and marvel at all his old haunts. The title of the novel, of course, is The Old Haunts. I just love that introduction. I think my favorite sentence in it is, the year was pulling at its reins. I encourage you to go watch my interview with Alan because he read the opening in his lovely Scottish accent. Next is a Polish-Welsh novel, I think is the way to describe it. Above Us the Sea by Anya Card, which I read in the second half of the year and really loved. And it is about the pejorative term which lots of gay men and their female friends embrace, have reclaimed as being not a pejorative term. It's like a fag hag novel. The protagonist, Toni, she's in Cardiff. She's Polish. And she's been studying at art school, I think, in Cardiff, and had quit. And then she goes to the gay bar, and she gets picked up. I don't mean in a sexual sense, but there is a bit of a vibe there. But it's not that kind of a story. But I just love the way this novel opens. I hope more of you will seek it out. And this is December 2013. I first met Gav 3 years ago on the dance floor of Pulse, Cardiff's loudest gay bar. Gav's face flickered in the whooping disco lights, and his body whirred in a dance to the sounds of Divine. A lithe body wrapped tight in a velvet red turtleneck and black leather trousers. Unrestricted in a spectrum of motion drawing men around him close. I admired the freedom in his movement, free from all of us dancing, free from our eyes on him. His face drowned in sound, eyes closed, lips mouthing the words, with a smile as if he had never danced before, and the dance was the answer. It was all there was. And the next award is for the best cover. And I think I might eventually abandon this because if a novel or a writer only gets an award in this category, it's a little bit of a slap in the face. But I am choosing a book that I didn't love. I liked it well enough, but didn't love it. And it does have a gorgeous cover. The Irish novel, The Coast Road by Alan Murren. This was a pseudo-buddy read with my friend, a subscriber, and top-tier supporter on Patreon, Alina. And that video is coming closer to the top of my pile of videos to edit. But we read it, we discussed it. I think I appreciated it a little better after I talked to her about it, but it didn't quite hit me. But look at that cover. The next is the book I wish I had bailed on. And I think I've already gotten rid of it. I can't find it anyway. I think I've already traded it in. But that was the gay novel The Whale Tattoo by John Ransom. I just thought it was overdone. The writing was beautiful, absolutely, and the audiobook was fabulously narrated. But the story was so melodramatic that I just stopped getting invested in it. It was just told in such a melodramatic voice that I couldn't stay connected to it. And also, why did he have to make the story so gross? The protagonist was a gay guy living on the coast of England, I think. Young guy, really screwed up with an awful dad and a boyfriend who was not the best for him. And he was kind of down and out and definitely not a rich man. And neither was his dad. And we get so much description of the stains on their underwear and all that kind of stuff and how gross everything was in the house. And I just thought, I guess that's realistic, but turned me off. So, wish I'd bailed on that one. The next is for my most favorite character. And this one's a tie between two characters in one of my top reads this year, and that's the Ontario novel, in terms of setting and where the author lives, Making Up the Gods by Marian Agnew. It's her debut novel, her second book, and it just was such an emotionally satisfying read, beautiful writing, and the two main characters, there's, I guess, three. I don't consider the third guy a major character, but he's a fairly significant minor character. But Simone is a young widow in that she's maybe 66 or something. She's not that old. And she is still living on the lake shore up near Thunder Bay. And she's a bit cranky, which I loved. And she knows she needs more people in her life, and she's on various church groups, but she's not maybe all that religious, and she doesn't really like being around people. She's my people. I identified with her very much. And there had been a terrible car accident in the community 6 months before where there was a whole bunch of people killed, including a father and son. And the son was maybe 15. His young widow and his remaining son were left, and the preacher, who knows that Simone wants to get more involved in the community, asked him if she would babysit Chen, this 9-year-old, for maybe a week while the mother goes and does something. And Simone reflexively says, no, I don't know anything about children. She had never had her own children. But she thinks about it for a few days and grumbles and thinks, okay. And then so Chen comes and stays with her. And Chen is this absolutely delightful 9-year-old, curious about everything. And the title comes from a comment he makes when they're out skipping rocks on the lakeshore about religion. And he thinks that, why don't we make up our own gods? So Making Up the Gods is the title. And he keeps a journal, and his journal entries are so pitch perfect in the voice of a 9-year-old who doesn't know how to spell but is curious about everything. And Simone is grumpy with him and tells him, okay, enough talking, go read your book or go play online for an hour. I'm sick of all this chatter. But she grows to love him and he loves her. And it's not sentimental, it's just wonderful. So those two characters were my favorite characters of the year. I actually don't have a most hated character. Again, it's a category I've had in past years that doesn't really resonate anymore. I used it for a few years to talk about characters that I think I was supposed to like, but I couldn't stand. Like the protagonist in, what's that Hungarian novel by Magda Szabo, The Door. I couldn't stand that woman. And so I created the category, but I haven't had a reaction like that to any of the characters this year. I think I'll probably retire that category. But I certainly have an award to give for the Pukeworthiest sentence, and that goes to a book that I bailed on close to the end of the year by a Newfoundlander writer, Rod Moody Corbett, called Hides. This was an aborted buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, and I'm not going to do a major rant about it because it is a debut novel. It has a high rating on Goodreads, but only about 14 ratings, and I really think most of those were his friends. But I won't even bother describing it other than to set up the quote. The first one was actually pointed out to me by Heidi. I think I was skimming by that point. Here's one Heidi pointed out, which I agree is pretty awful. Is this it? Willis asked. His eyebrows retreated as his nose quested across the rafters like a rat's. But the absolute worst, which really was what made me bail, about 60% into it. It's a 2-sentence thing, but it's the last sentence. I unwrapped one of my power bars and waved the stiff, wiry snack under my nose. It smelled like a roomful of cardboard soused in grainy ganache. I took a bite, and a game of tug-of-war, in which metaphor, you might say, my teeth served as rope, ensued. Ay, ay, ay. Editing Shawn here while I was barely into that bottle of wine. So I can't blame it on that, but I guess I just announced the next topic in my head. I didn't tell you what it was. So the next award is for the best conclusion. So this is a three-way tie. And the first one is The Language of Remembering by Patrick Holloway. And I won't read this because it wouldn't have a standalone thing. I'd have to read so much of it to communicate, to express why it's such a great ending. I'll just characterize the ending of this fabulous debut novel from Ireland, The Language of Remembering by Patrick Holloway. Oh, I love this. And it's about a mother and son. And the mother, in the present, is very young, like in her late 50s maybe, and she's got really early onset Alzheimer's, and by the time her son and his Brazilian wife and their kid come back to Ireland from Brazil, she is almost to the point where she doesn't know people, but not quite. And it's the story of those last few months of relationship where one of the things that she loses is her ability to speak English, and so she's only speaking in Irish, which her son never learned. Fascinating stuff about language and remembering. It's just so great. And then the other timeline is back when she got pregnant as a high school kid with this son. And it was a big taboo, obviously, in Irish Catholic. And that part of the story is wonderful. And the flashback at the end was just incredible. I will read the last few lines because it's not a spoiler, because it's remembering them stepping into their new house that they had built right after their marriage. And her husband's name is James. "We'll be happy here, won't we?" she says, walking next to him. "We will. We'll be really happy." She smiles, and they walk to the front door, and she knows inside of herself that it will open out a new future, and that James is right. They will be happy here. The second one is Elizabeth Jane Howard's last novel before she started the Cazalet Chronicles, which I just read close to the end of the year, Getting It Right, which was published in about 82, I think. And the protagonist here, Gavin, he's a shy, sensitive hairdresser, and he's not very assertive. But he becomes more assertive over the course of and he's not sure if he's gay or straight, he's never had sex, and he's got a really domineering mother, and he lives with his parents, and he's 30-something, 30, 31. And he keeps meeting these unusual women that just whirl him into various confusing situations. It's not a spoiler if I don't tell you which of the women, but one of the women, in many ways the most unlikely woman that he would partner with, something seems to be happening between them. So it's not a spoiler to say that. And the ending between them, it's just leaving it open, but with some promise that something might happen. It's just gorgeous. I won't read to you from it. And I also absolutely adored the ending to this queer novel by a Calgary, Alberta, Canada writer, We Are All of Us Left Behind by Bradley Somer. He was my Mr. Guest. I'll put a link to that. And I also interviewed him on stage for his Saskatoon book launch about it. It's a wonderful novel, and the ending is really powerful. The protagonist here seems to be gay. I think he is queer. He's a young man, and he is either abandoned or orphaned by his parents and goes on a trek back to Serbia, where he has a grandfather who is a famous Serbian writer and gets into all kinds of misadventures on the way. The story starts out in Alberta and ends up in Serbia. And in Serbia, there's a friend he meets. And it ends up in a similar way to Elizabeth Jane Howard's Getting It Right. I'm not going to read it because it doesn't have a standalone vitality, but it was just pitch perfect for the ending of this, in a way, madcap, but also deeply emotionally satisfying novel. Do check this one out for sure. And the next award is for Best Sentence, and I have another tie here. The first one comes from near the end of this marvelous memoir by Saskatchewan writer, my friend, frequent guest on my channel, Sharon Batala, and that's called Where I Live Now, A Journey Through Love and Loss to Healing and Hope. And this is a sentence about her husband, and she writes a lot in various of her memoirs about her life on the ranch in southern Saskatchewan with her husband, Peter. And she had grown up in a rural environment. She'd been a city girl from probably preteen until then. I think she might have been about 40 and spent 30 years with him. Maybe she was about 40, I'm not sure. But she spent about 30 years on the ranch in southern Saskatchewan, which was a complete unknown for her to wander into. And she's written beautifully about the nature and the history and the culture of that part of the world and that part of the prairies. And it's searing, insightful, and gorgeous. This is a sentence about Peter near the end of the book, and it just captures his character in one sentence. I just love it. He's been dead now, I think, for 30 years, 25 years. How I loved him for his easy courage that was mostly plain old knowledge shaped by common sense. His competency that seemed to me at times to reach a kind of brilliance, as if in a crisis his brain would crack open in a new place. That's how the light gets out. And the second best sentence of the year is from this wonderful backlist Irish novel, The Pornographer, by John McGairn. Oh my God, I love this novel. And we don't need any context. It's just gorgeous sentence. The prayers could not be answered, but prayers that cannot be answered need to be the more completely said, being their own beginning as well as end. Oh my God. The next award is for the best short story. And I read a lot of great stories this year, and there's a tie for this also in the same collection. The collection is Animal Person by Alexander MacLeod. And the first story that I absolutely adored was The Dead Want. And it's about a family funeral in Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia area. A young woman, she's maybe 22, 25. She's killed in a bizarre traffic accident. She gets flipped off of an ATV when her boyfriend, who was driving, she was sitting behind him, made a turn or something, and it was a freak accident and killed instantly. The niece gets killed, and so the branch of the Nova Scotian family that now lives in, I think, Toronto has to make a long car trip, and they're worried about how much money it's going to cost, but they would not think of ever missing this funeral for this much beloved young woman. And so our protagonist is her first cousin, this part of the Ontario family that's driving back, and lots of memories about what their cousinship had been when he was growing up. I'm not going to give a thing away, except that the power of the story is the interaction between him and the grieving boyfriend who had been driving, who is completely not a part of the funeral. It's just absolutely incredible. So that one's called The Dead Want. The second story that I absolutely loved is called The Entertainer, and it's near the end. And oh my God, it's probably got one of the most fascinating structures. The way that it's presented to you through multiple points of view, it's mind-blowing. And it's about a piano recital, or one of the many things it's about, is a piano recital at an old folks' home. And one of the characters is the young guy, maybe 11 or 12, that's been roped into playing the entertainer, the piece of music, The Entertainer, the Scott Joplin. A quick aside here. The first music I ever loved in my life was Scott Joplin. And I was like 10, 11, something like that. And I didn't like pop music of any kind, but I borrowed a tape of Scott Joplin's music from the library, and I just loved it. And I still love it today. And I listened to it today, not even thinking about this story, and just realized how deeply it's impressed on my psyche. But anyway, this kid, it doesn't play it very well, and his parents are kind of saying, are you sure you want to play this at the concert? Or sure you don't want to practice more? And we hear about his piano teacher, and there's probably other characters I'm forgetting, but the other key characters are a musically talented elderly woman who's in the depths of Alzheimer's, and her husband is living at the home with her and taking care of her, but she requires far more care than he does. And there's a lot of description of that that's really moving, poignant, and sad. And then what happens at the recital? Oh my God! My award, quote-unquote, award for most disappointing read will shock some of you that didn't see my Friday Reads where I talk this. And Alina, fast forward, because this is Alina's favorite book in the world, Jean Rhys's Wild Sargasso Sea. I am such a fan of Jean Rhys's stuff, and I've read quite a bit of it. And I got to this late because I don't like retellings or anything that's... So it's not a retelling, but it's a prequel, in a way, to Jane Eyre about the quote-unquote mad woman in the attic. And that part didn't interest me. That was why I put off reading it. But I just love Jean Rhys's writing. I love the writing in here, but I didn't like it very much. I liked it. I didn't love it at all. I liked it because the writing was gorgeous. The atmosphere was vivid. But it was really gothic, and I don't want that kind of literature in my life. Thank you very much. Because I love, in a 7.5 star kind of way, everything else I've read by Jean Rhys, this was a disappointment. The next award is kind of a catch-all category, but I call it the book that stayed with me or is aging well. So it's a book that I wasn't necessarily as sure about when I finished it as I am now, or that I find myself still thinking about it. And so that, hands down, goes to the latest novel by Louise Erdrich, The Mighty Red. And I did this mostly on audio, and I enjoyed it very much, but I realized by the end that this is the kind of book that needs to be either an audio-text combo, I did enjoy the audio version, or just read it. There's certain audiobooks that I can't sink into as deeply as they need to be sunk into, and this was one. So I really liked it a lot. In fact, I can't say I loved it, but I think I missed some of the nuances that a reread would help me with. So I've been thinking about it a lot. It's about a Métis American family, and there's a wedding, and the young girl, she's got two lovers, and it's very funny, but also a tragedy. So it reminded me, in a way, of the tragedy of the story The Dead Want, but also about another American novel, which isn't in any of my awards, so I won't mention it. I'll put this GIF up here because I wasn't prepared to mention it. But there was a lot going on, and it worked. I didn't have any question about whether it worked. I just thought, you know what? I think there's more here that I need to chew on and possibly reread. The next award is for the most vivid setting, and oh boy, I'm so glad I get a chance to rave about this book. This is the 1943 British novel, Oh, the Brave Music, by Dorothy Evelyn Smith, brought back into print from the British Library's Women Writers series, or whatever it's called, and I read this to my mom. If you don't happen to know, I read separately to two of my favorite ladies, my mom, and also to my cousin Mary Jean. Different books, separately, maybe 10 pages a night or whatever, and I read this one to my mom, and we both just absolutely adored it. Why don't more people know about this book? It's as good as any famous novel of the period. I want to change that. Hopefully right now I'm going to make you go out and read it because it's just so wonderful. It's a coming-of-age story. Starting from childhood, Ruanne is a child before the First World War, and her father's a really stern Methodist preacher, and her mother is anything but stern or Methodist. And then we follow her life, moving from the manse to a more rural setting, staying with a friend. And that family becomes a second family on the moors of Yorkshire. And it is, I think it's Yorkshire, but certainly near Yorkshire. I don't remember specifically. But the setting, both the pinched, subdued, strict atmosphere of the manse and the town that they lived in, but then also this much more natural, free setting of her friends that live on the moors. All of that. And then later she's living with an uncle in the family home, and it's a creaky old mansion, and all of it is just so tenderly and beautifully described that it gets the award for the best setting. And I passionately recommend any of you who are into literature of the era who haven't tried it, please do so. I don't seem to have this book in my pile. Maybe I've already gotten rid of it, but anyway, don't need it. The next award is the most surprising bail, and that goes to the story collection Cat Brushing by Jane Campbell. She's a British writer, and she's in her mid-80s, and the title story, Cat Brushing, was published when she was 75 in the London Review of Books, and I did really enjoy that story quite a lot. And then the short story collection by the same title came out, and I did a buddy read with one of my subscribers who lives in Australia, Louise, and I think she liked it a bit better than me, but I think there was one other story in the collection that I enjoyed, but most of them were really subpar. There was like one or two good stories, but that was it. I love reading fiction written by an elderly person. I love fiction about elderly women especially. So it was in my wheelhouse. It couldn't have been any more in my wheelhouse than it was, and I didn't like it. So I was surprised and disappointed. All right, I can hear my voice getting a little croakier, so time to have another glass of wine, don't you think? The next award is for most moving passage or scene, and I'm not going to read anything to you, not just because I don't trust my voice, but I'm just going to describe some of the moving parts of these books. So I've already talked about Making Up the Gods, how much I love the two main characters, Simone and the 9-year-old she's taking care of, babysitting for a week, Chen. But this was an incredibly moving story about grief and either literal, but probably psychological ghosts that we carry, and tragedy, and a secular theology, if that makes sense. This kid, I don't know if he believes anything particularly religious, but there's a lot of theological reflection and how literature can expand our vision, and betrayal, suspiciousness, and trust. And I just found so much of this, especially those journal entries by Ched, and the push-pull between the 60-something character, Simone's crankiness on the one hand, and lovingness on the other. This novel, also, Small Reckonings by Karen Melberg Schreer, is a top read of the year, and oh my god, it was so moving. So the premise is a homesteading couple. He's a New Zealander that's been in Canada for 2 years and homesteading in Saskatchewan in the 19 teens, I think. And his Ontario wife that he woos and brings back to this homestead. And they start to have a family. Now, the mother had been traumatized before she got married by something that we don't really know much about at first, to do with a job she had at I don't know what it would have been called. It probably would have been called an asylum in the day, in a place in Ontario. And when she gives birth, her second child is born with Down syndrome. It's not named that. I won't repeat what language was used in 1920 or whatever for that. But when she gives birth to this baby girl that is intellectually disabled, it just triggers all the stuff that happened that she's never talked to her husband about and that she's never really dealt with. And so it becomes tragic. And there's so many tragedies in the novel, and there's so much love in the novel. Anytime I recommend this novel so passionately, I have to give a trigger warning for sexual assault. But I hope that you're the kind of reader that's not going to turn you off, because there's so much love and on sentimental psychological healing and even humor in the book. It's absolutely incredible and chock full of poignant scenes that just grab you by the heart. I don't think I need to say much more about this Irish debut novel, The Language of Remembering by Patrick Holloway, but oh my god, it is also just overflowing with, again, unsentimentally poignant scenes. So when I talk about moving scenes, I always mean devoid of any sentimentality. So, yeah, this was just a powerful and very deeply moving novel. This was one of the last books I read in 2025. I feel a little bit, I kind of pity novels I read so close to the end of the year, because they get short shrift in terms of, is it my favorite book of the year, or is it going to be in my top 10? It needs space to breathe in me. So I actually think I don't have any other New Year's resolutions in terms of my reading, but one is, if I'm reading a book that I'm deeply connected with, to slow read it so it doesn't end up being finished at the end of the year where I don't have the perspective on it, to include it in my Besties and Worsties. And in fact, the book after this that gets the award for most moving passage or scene is one where I started it at the end of 2024 and finished it in 2025. I wish I'd done that with this one. But this one definitely gets this award, and that's the Ukrainian novel The Sunflower Boys by Sam Walkman. And the first couple of years of it, set just a couple of years before the fascist Russian invasion of Ukraine. Artem is 12 years old, and he's got a best friend that lives down the street. And he gradually, once his adolescence starts to bloom, realizes he's falling in love with that friend. And then the invasion happens, and all hell breaks loose. And this is a very vivid depiction of what it's like to go from the kind of a childhood in the modern era that any of us would recognize, and then to be plunged into a new reality that's about killing and violence and hunger and desperation that comes with being in a war-torn country. It's just so well done, especially about that. Ordinary people being caught up in war. Two more. The next one is the American debut novel, The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. Oh, I love this book. It's an epistolary novel, and the woman is, I think, around 68 when it starts and 71 when it finishes or something. But we get lots of retrospective stuff. She is a letter writer. Her entire personal life has been carried out via usually snail mail correspondence, although there are a few emails in here as well. You don't necessarily fall in love with Sybil at first, but the more you learn about her life and the way that it's coming at you indirectly through all these letters, and the gathering power of a life lived through letter writing, and the coming to terms with mistakes made in the past, and unfinished business from the past, and how they get processed through letters, it obliterated me in the best way possible. And finally, also deeply moving, was this novel I've already talked about, The Old Haunts by Alan Radcliffe, this queer Scottish novel. So, the main character, Jamie, he's grieving, and he's in a new relationship. And he's the kind of person that is a little bit quiet, and a deep thinker, and very observant about people and his surroundings, and just the way he connects, or in some cases doesn't connect, with what's going on around him, and his memories of his parents. There's so much that, again, it's reflective and poignant in that non-sentimental way. I just loved this novel. It haunts me still. I have to say the next award is probably my favorite every year. And I did my favorite sentence, but this is my goofiest, bestest quote of the year, and I have a three-way tie again. The first one comes from this Swiss novel that I read for Women in Translation Month. I think that's what I read it for. It's called About Uncle by Rebecca Geisler, translated from the German, I believe, by Jordan Stump. I liked the novel, didn't love it. It was a bit too madcap for me, but there were some funny parts. So it's from the perspective of an adult niece and nephew of their uncle, who's been a bit of a layabout and a bit of a eccentric, unfulfilled, kind of gross loser. And he is humanized in the story, but mostly he's just out there. And here is an example. This is about whenever somebody comes to visit, he makes this dish, and I hope I can pronounce, I think it's a French name. Uncle also claims to be the custodian of the time-honored recipe for calamari à l'armoricaine, a recipe that consists of frozen squid rings, vaguely cooked in half a gallon of cheap red wine, seasoned only with a pinch of pepper. A dish, I should add, reserved for special occasions, for honored guests, for first-time visitors, because Uncle likes to give all newcomers a lavish welcome, at least those who are too polite to refuse what they're so beamingly being offered. And when we suggest to Uncle that he add some garlic, and go a little lighter on the red wine, and have a look at the sell-by date on the squid, and also take a shower just a little more often, a real shower, not just a swipe with a wet washcloth, no, a real cleaning from top to bottom, Uncle says simply, no, he doesn't want to. He's sticking to his father's recipe. And the next goofiest bestest sentence comes from the penultimate Elizabeth Jane Howard that I read this year, Odd Girl Out, which I also loved. And one of the main characters here is a sexy young woman. She is a stepsister of the husband in a married couple, and she comes to stay with them, and all hell breaks loose. Arabella is her name. And this is a sentence about her, which I just loved. She had some odd idea that a person who read constantly, and chiefly fiction at that, might know some difficult things about human nature that she did not want to have explained to her. And this one's a bit odd, because it's not actually from the novel. I did really enjoy the novel, but it comes from the introduction to the novel. The 1954 British novel, A Wreath for the Enemy, by Pamela Frankow. I read this one to my mum, and she actually liked it a bit better than I did, although I did really like it. And this is a sentence about Pamela Frankow in the introduction. I should tell you who the introduction is by. It's by Raffaella Barker, and that is the daughter of the Scottish novelist and journalist Elspeth Barker, who wrote O Caledonia. Her sheer enjoyment in the freedom of her pen was reminiscent of an adolescent dog let off its leash in a field peppered with interesting smells. The next award is for the book I'm most likely to reread the soonest, and hands down that goes to the Palestinian novel, Gaza Weddings by Ibrahim Nasrallah, translated from the Arabic by Nancy Roberts. This was for my Patreon book club. If you're watching this and you're maybe new to my channel or haven't tuned in for a while, I have a Patreon account where people that want to support what I'm doing take a membership, and we've got a book club, and we've got various things going on. There's a link in the show notes for that. And any of you who don't want to make that kind of a commitment, I have bookmarks for sale, and there's links to that in the show notes as well. But anyway, the second last book we did for our book club was Gaza Weddings, and I loved it and thought I understood it. And then we started talking on the Patreon book club Zoom chat, and I realized that a lot of it had gone over my head. And I felt a little bit embarrassed, and I shouldn't be embarrassed, just read it straight. But there were other people who read it as having a lot of maybe magical realist qualities, and that's something that I have quite a bit of an allergy to, but I thought, oh, I need to reread this. So that's why it gets this award. But if you have a bigger brain than I and aren't so adverse to magical realism, you'll probably get it in one shot, but do try it. This is not a book that anybody else, I don't think, on BookTube has ever talked about. And I don't even remember how I found out about it, but we read it at the Patreon book club, and everybody, I think, was very favorable about it, and I certainly really liked it. Didn't necessarily get everything, but really liked it. And I think when I talked about The Mighty Red by Louise Erdrich, I made quite a case about why it would be also a book I will reread fairly soon. So the next category is the top 3 nonfiction. And 2 of them are by the same author. Let's start with those. I read 2 memoirs by Sharon Batalla in 2025, and they both knocked my socks off. So I've already talked about Where I Will Live Now, A Journey Through Loss and Love to Healing and Hope, and it's powerful. Now, all of them build upon her first memoir. She's written other nonfiction books, so it's arguable how many of those are memoirs, but The Perfection of the Morning I read about 3 years ago and absolutely loved. I have an interview with her about that. I think I've buddy read virtually everything I've read by Sharon Batalla with Heidi of My Reading Life. The Perfection of the Morning is about her experience living as a rancher's wife, leaving Saskatoon actually, and going to live on this ranch and getting not just accustomed to that lifestyle, but just opening to the natural world around her and the indigenous spiritual presence around her and the history and archaeology and all of that stuff, and just gorgeous nature writing. And then Where I Live Now builds upon that, and it's about maybe the first decade of her life after Peter Batalla dies, and she decides what to do. She has to close. She sold the ranch and closes it down, moves to Calgary. So very much a memoir of grief and picking up where she left off, but also deepening a lot of the stuff that she wrote about so wondrously in Perfection of the Morning, and it just got all the way inside me. I adored it. That was published a few years ago. And then, maybe in the fall of this year, I don't remember the month, the third in that series came out, How to Breathe Water. And I have a full interview with her on my channel. I'll be linking that. And also, I was very lucky to be asked to be her on stage, I never know how to say it, but interviewer for the book launch here in Saskatoon. Oh, this book broke me. With all the candor of the first 2, this one breaks new ground. And Sharon Batalla is 85, and she has no F's left to give. So in this memoir, we get a whole bunch of truths that I never thought they were missing from the earlier memoirs, but oh my God. So just profound meditations on the genocidal origins of settler Canada, especially in Saskatchewan. Revelations about marriage and sexual violence. Just hard-won realizations over a lifetime of reading and writing and living as a prairie woman writer. It just blew my effing mind. And the third one was a collection of autobiographical essays from the UK called Cold Fish Soup by Adam Ferrer. And he lives, or for a time in his childhood, he grew up near Withersea in the 90s. It's on the Holderness Coast, which is in Yorkshire. And these are very funny and, in many cases, deeply moving essays about mental health, his family, the landscape environmental issues and the history of this area, which is off the beaten track, and so it's dying a slow death. He doesn't live there anymore. He's in Manchester. But in a way, this is a complicated love story about where his formative years were spent and how he relates to it as a now, I don't know, he might have been 35 when he wrote these essays that take in environmental and political concerns and, again, tragic mental health stuff in his family. His mother was on Britain's Got Talent, and there's a fabulous essay about that. So they're really varied. And the best essays, and many of them, over half of them, are absolutely fantastic, marry humor and tragedy perfectly. But there are, I'd say, two or three where those two strands of his personality, they bump up against each other. So there's a couple of them that don't work, but most of them were just to die for. I loved Cold Fish Soup, and I've recently learned he had another essay collection come out, I think at the beginning of 2025, which Heidi and I are going to be buddy reading in 2026. The next award is for The Bale I'm Most Likely to Try Again, and that award goes to the book of short stories that won the International Booker Prize, Heartlamp and Other Stories by Banu Mushtaq, translated from the Canada by Deepa Bashti. I loved the first 3 or 4 stories, and then I felt that they were all too samey, but I got chided by some people whose taste I really respect and thought, you know what, maybe I just had too much going on in my life. I did all of them either on audio or as an audio text combo, and I thought, no, I need to try this again. I think maybe it just wasn't the right time, but I don't want to write it off prematurely. The next award is for the most surprising 5-star read. Again, a tie. The first one was this short story, which was very expensively put out in a hardcover edition, Galatea by Madeline Miller. I don't like myth retellings. I have quite a profound allergy to them, and that's exactly what this short story is. And of course, you all know that Madeline Miller, that's her shtick. She wrote The Song of Achilles and others. But I was swept away by the writing. I didn't care. It was a retelling or kind of a jumping off point of the Pygmalion myth. I didn't care about the myth. You didn't need to know anything about the myth or even particularly view it through that lens to appreciate what a powerful short story it was, which she wrote it before the incel movement, misogynist young men that can't get laid, so they become misogynist pigs and have created this whole ideology about it. She felt quite almost prophetic in a bad way when this story anticipated the emergence of that crap. But I love the writing. I don't know if I want to read another book by her. I wish she'd write something that didn't have myths in it. But the fact that I loved it was surprising. The other one was surprising because I had tried an earlier novel by this writer and didn't like it and bailed on it. This is by the Nigerian-British novelist Chibundo Onuzo, Sankofa, and I always feel a little bit embarrassed to have an ex-library copy. I tried. Was it her debut? I'm not sure, but it had a gorgeous cover. Welcome to Lagos. And I thought, when I got about halfway through, that it wasn't believable. There was something about the character work and then what happens in the plot that I thought, oh, this doesn't make sense for me, so I abandoned it. And I don't regret it. But Sankofa is a much more superior piece of fiction. It's about a Nigerian-British woman whose white mother dies, and her African father, Onuzo creates a fictional African country where he comes from, but she discovers her father's diaries in the bottom of a trunk that her mother had, and that starts her journey to find her father. He was in London studying when he met her mother. He actually rented a room in the house, and then he went back to his country because I think his mother died, and he never came back. And he ended up becoming the president of that country, and he's now the ex-president, and his term in office was not unblemished from a human rights point of view, and she goes in search of him. It's a fascinating story and really well done, and I can't wait to see what Chibundu Onuzo does next. The next award goes for the best title, another tie. And again, this is a category that's unfortunate if the authors of the book don't get any other awards in my Besties and Worsties. But in this case, they absolutely do, and I love the titles of both of them. They're actually both published by the same publisher, Freehand Books in Calgary. Sharon Battali's most recent memoir, How to Breathe Water. I love that title. How to Breathe Water. You have to read deeply and read pretty much all the way to the end to get what she's getting at with such an incredible and seemingly elusive title. Oh my God. And the second one is the queer novelist, Australian-born but Calgary-based, Bradley Somers, We Are All of Us Left Behind, which is, again, another enigmatic title. When I asked him in 2 separate interviews about the title, he's a bit mischievous in a deep intellectual way. He said, "What do you think it means?" So you can go watch my mystery guest chats. And I'm still reflecting on what the title means, and that speaks volumes about how perfect of a title it is. It doesn't give me a lot of pleasure to tell you that this book has won 2 of my awards. Those awards are my worst read published this year. It's in reprint form. And my worst read of the year, the Tanzanian novel, Rosa Mystica by Euphrasie Kezalahabi. And it was translated from the Swahili by J. Boss Rubin. This was also a Patreon book discussion. And I just loathed this book. I thought it was so didactic, poorly written, with characters that didn't make sense. It had a meaning in Swahili culture, in Tanzanian culture at the time, but it didn't translate it anything that was worth my time. I will never get those 5 hours back that I spent time with this just crappy novel. Rosa is the teenage main character. She lives on an island in Lake Victoria. That part was interesting, the setting. Her father's a drunk, but her mother has been saving her pennies to send her to school. And then there's all the sexual and misogynist pitfalls that befall her. But I just didn't feel any pity for her because it wasn't well written enough for me to get invested in anything. She had a tragic life, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and it certainly lays bare the post-colonial misogyny. Maybe there was misogyny in the original culture. I don't know anything about that, but I just thought it was poorly written and a waste of my valuable time. I hasten to add that most people in my Patreon book club discussion didn't think it was as bad as all that, so I'm just stating my own case. Maybe it'll be the best book you've ever read if you try it. So the last award of my Besties and Worsties is my top 10 fiction. I think it used to be my top 3, but there's no possible way. With the fantastic reading year I've had, I could keep it down to 3. So some of them I've talked about in enough length that I will not say much more about them. And they're not ranked from 1 to 10. Maybe the first 3 I would rank in my best and second best and third best, but I'm not even sure about that. I have a top read, and then the rest really are all my second most favorite reads of the year. So my top read is by the Saskatoon writer Karen Melberg-Schweer, Small Reckonings, and I just love this novel so much. It was a tough novel full of tragedy, but also, like I say, love and affection, and just a subtle, sophisticated exploration of mental health, disability, intellectual disability in particular, the deprivations of the homesteading life in the early 20th century in Saskatchewan, and a really dark and layered portrayal of motherhood, about a mother who's so psychologically wounded herself that she cannot be a good mother to her child who she loves. Oh my God. What I haven't said yet about this novel that I appreciated, I've already given the content warning about sexual assault in this novel. And the perpetrator of that assault is a man well regarded and extremely well known by all the main characters in the book in this small rural community in Saskatchewan. A neighbor. But where my reading of the novel deepened exponentially was in the last maybe third of the novel. We get a sense of that perpetrator through the eyes of another neighbor who had known him since he was a young boy, and where that neighbor helped him in a difficult situation. And that just complicated everything. So this man who perpetrated such a horrible thing, there were also other aspects of his character that Karen Malberg Schreer put in your face near the end of the novel. And I so deeply respected that, and how it made me, the reader, squirm and wonder. For both my mom and I, our reckonings with everything this novel made us think and feel about were anything but small. Let me digress here for a minute. Most of the best books I read in 2025 were from small independent presses, many of them Canadian, but not all of them. I have educated myself about mainstream publishing houses, which are multinational and they don't have any real connection to a country. Like we've got McClelland and Stewart, but it's owned by Paramount or something. There's no encouragement of new voices that would launch some of these regional works of fiction out before a bigger audience. And my evolution as a reader is to move away from what's being published by Penguin or whatever into books being published by smaller independent presses. And that's where the gold has been in my reading year. So, Small Reckonings, which I just talked about, and this next one, they deserved to win major national or international book prizes. That's how good they are in my somewhat less than humble estimation. The next one is Making Up the Gods by Marian Agnew. I've talked about it quite a bit already. I'm not going to say much more. I have a lovely full-length interview with Marian Agnew about it. It's part of Shawn Bree's books canon. But I can't get too ideological about publishers and stuff because the next one, and is it my third favorite or whatever, but oh, how I love this book. And this one was published by Penguin Random House. The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. Again, I don't want to be too doctrinaire. It's getting more and more attention. I saw there was something in today's New York Times, maybe an interview with her, or was it maybe on the New York Times book podcast? But the New York Times didn't get to her before I did. I have a lovely interview with Virginia Evans about this novel, as I've talked about quite a bit. An epistolary novel, the joys and tragedies and personality of the protagonist, Sybil Van Antwerp, who's in her late 60s when the story opens and goes until a few years later. But what I haven't talked about before that was so powerful about this novel in letters was that at first I cringed because she attempted to make a personal connection or a personal relationship with every person she encountered, at least in her later stages of her life. For example, the guy at the help desk at the DNA blood matching, What's Your Ancestors website, and she attempts to befriend him, and I'm just cringing, like, he's just on a help desk somewhere. He's is he from maybe India or something? And she's like that. She wants to make a personal connection. She had been auditing classes at a nearby university, but then the new Dean of Arts limited the kind of people that maybe geographically or something, who could audit classes, and so she couldn't take any more classes, and she just bombards this new female dean, keeps trying to make the connection personal, and I would just cringe, and then it becomes absolutely and unsentimentally not the slightest bit cringy. It's something I just deeply loved about this novel. Next is the Canadian novel, This Bright Dust by Nina Burkhout. She was my mystery guest, and then I did a follow-up interview with her once I'd read this wonderful novel. This is set in maybe 1938 to 1939 in Alberta. The Depression lasted longer in this part of Alberta than it did anywhere else in the West. The Dirty 30s had largely passed on in other Western Canadian regions, but not in this area. The King and Queen are coming to Canada, and they were in Canada maybe 2 months. I don't know how long the royal tour lasted, but it was the first major royal visit from reigning monarchs in Canadian history. And they were there to whip up support for what they thought would be the war, which they were right. There was going to be a war. The characters in the novel Some of them are really pro-monarchist. There's a little kid. It reminded me of myself, although I wasn't a kid in 1939, but I was a kid in the 70s who was completely gawky and monarchist to the max. But there's the neighbor across the way who hates the royal family and all they represent. That tension makes the reader, especially the Canadian reader, think deeply about Canadian identity. I am somewhat of a monarchist. I wouldn't die on that hill, but I'm fascinated by the royals, and I loved the nuances of the character work here. It's a love story. It's a story of the hardship of the Depression era, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Check out my full interview with Nina, This Bright Dust. This was also in my top 10, The Old Haunts by Alan Radcliffe. I've talked about it quite a bit. I passionately hold it out to you and say, your reading life is incomplete until you read it. Another novel, I haven't mentioned it yet, that is deeply imprinted on me from 2025 is the Saskatchewan novel Cool Water by Diane Warren. It won the Governor General's Award in 2010 or 2011, and I read this to my mum, and we both deeply appreciated the cast of characters in it. Is set in a small town in southern Saskatchewan. It's one of Sharon Battala's and David Carpenter's most favorite Saskatchewan novels, and it's set, I believe, in a fictional town. There's a banker, there's a bunch of farmers. There are strong memories of a camel named Antoinette. And the way that Warren threads those stories together with deep, vibrant meditations on history, because it opens with a story about characters that we never see again from about 100 years before on the same landscape, in the same geographical place before the town existed, and how those historical echoes reverberate through the modern day characters' travels through the same landscape. It was just incredible. Lots of humor here, deep character work. I'm still puzzling over it. It won the Canadian Governor General's Award 15 years ago, but it needs to be read now. It's so alive. And I'm so delighted that one of my subscribers and Patreons from New Zealand, on the basis of my enthusiasm for the book, read it and also quite enjoyed it. The next one is the British novel Hope Never Knew Horizon by Douglas Bruton. Douglas Bruton has been a discovery that I made a few years ago with another novel of his in the last few years. He's so prolific. But his 2023 novella, With or Without Angels. Lindy and I had a pseudo buddy read it, and we absolutely loved it. And then Douglas Bruton, who lives on the Scottish borders in the UK, reached out to us, and then we interviewed him about his 2024 novel, Hope Never Knew Horizon. And that is definitely in my top 10 reads of the year. And this has 3 storylines with separate characters who were real characters in history. And Douglas wrote it after the election of Trump in the first go-around, I think. Certainly he wrote it because of Trump and the absence of hope in the late 2010s or early 2020s. We start out in Wexford County in 1891. A beached whale is discovered on the coast, and somebody finds it and then sells it to a national museum. The second setting is Amherst, Massachusetts, 1850, and the character telling the story is a maid at the Dickinson, Emily Dickinson, at the Dickinson family home. And she's Snoopy, and she finds a correspondence between Emily Dickinson and her soon-to-be sister-in-law that seems to go beyond familial affection. And the other storyline is in London, starts in 1880, and it's a woman who was a real person again, Ada Alice Pullen, who becomes a model for the painter Frederick Leighton. And she is a model for the painting that is shown on the cover. This is also one of the best covers of the year, I must say, for a painting named Hope. And you can also see the whale skeleton, and Hope Never Knew Horizon is an excerpt of a line from a letter Emily Dickinson wrote. I think in 2025 we all needed some hope, and I absolutely loved it. I would be delighted if any of you sought Douglas Bruton's books out, and maybe especially Hope Never Knew Horizon. Okay, the last three, I've talked about them quite a bit, so I'm just going to hold them up. Getting It Right by Elizabeth Jane Howard, a really funny novel that went far beyond humor and made me deeply care about this lost soul, this neurotic young man. And again, Language of Remembering by Patrick Holloway. I dare you to read this and not fall in love. And Above Us the Sea. I think some readers might be put off by how effed up the young Polish woman Toni is, but I fell in love with her vulnerability, her openness, and her deep feeling for the people she encountered in the story. And the writing is whip smart and evocative. What a lovely year of reading I've had. Thank you for watching.